The iPod was first released by Apple on October 23, 2001. A revolution in MP3 player technology, it was designed to streamline and simplify the music listening experience. Did it? Well, strap in as we delve through the iconic history of the iPod. Enter Steve Jobs, a narcissist, a bad father, a stealer of credit, and the man behind Apple. He developed the Macintosh computer system out of his garage in the early 1980s with Steve Wozniak. Enter 2000-ish, where Steve Jobs is pissed. He's just plain sick and tired of how clunky and poorly designed MP3 players are. So he got up off his throne of $100 bills, was chauffeured to his studio, and recruited Tony Fadell, who had the idea of pairing an MP3 player with a digital storefront. With that, Apple began development on Project P68. With just roughly a year of development behind it, the first generation iPod debuted on October 23rd, 2001. The name being a reference to...
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal.
Taking visual inspiration from Braun's T3 radio and a B&O phone with a spinning wheel, the iPod looked like nothing that had come before. It was packed with 5 gigabytes of storage and came pre-packaged with iTunes. So, if you connected your iPod to your Mac, for just 99 cents a song, you could add pretty much anything you wanted onto the little iconic device. After that, the years would bring on update after update. There was the 2nd gen iPod, the 3rd gen iPod, the 4th gen iPod, and a million more gens of iPods. Plus the iPod mini and the iPod Nano, which, as the name implies, were iPods, but smaller. The iPod sold like absolute gangbusters at first, due mostly to the Silhouette campaign, which put the aforementioned silhouetted people in front of colorful backgrounds with a white iPod in hand. They would dance to popular songs of the era. And the only info given would be the tagline, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Initially, Jobs couldn't stand the idea, but turned around and eventually tried to take credit for it. Remember when I said this guy was a bad person? The iPod Touch would use features established in the first iPhone to improve the iPod experience. Improved user interface, a touch screen, and HD video streaming were all included in the first generation iPod Touch, which was released on September 5th, 2007. This was a huge step up for the iPod, as previously the wheel was the only way that you could navigate or really do anything. The touchscreen simplified things and made the iPod more accessible than it had ever been. Now that you know the journey of the iPod, it's time to lay out what contributed to its demise. And now, we've come to the roast session of the evening. Let's face it, the iPod kind of sucked. If we're all going to be real. It was a great device while it lasted, but in its later years, it started to kind of fall behind. The iPod had a weak battery. Despite Apple promoting that the 5th generation iPod could last up to 14 hours on a full charge, customers reported less than 8 hours of life, with degrading batteries intensifying the battery issues. Apple refused to recall or replace the degrading batteries, instead encouraging customers to buy a new iPod. This was actually an early example of a tactic Apple uses today, as each new iOS update is designed to lessen performance on older devices to encourage users to purchase new ones. I'd like to once again say that Steve Jobs was not the nicest man. The iPod Touch was also just frail, a glass screen with aluminum covering up the circuitry. It wasn't exactly made of concrete, you know, glass is fragile. When I was a kid, I dropped my iPod Touch 3 feet off the ground and the entire top of the screen shattered. It was brutal. This complaint had been leveled towards Apple, who simply brushed it off, because what else could they make it with that was both cheap and affordable? Nothing. The last nail in the coffin was the iPhone. When it first released, the iPhone was not built for listening to music as much as it was for making phone calls. You know, it's a phone. After all, it was 2007, and they hadn't yet discovered Angry Birds. But, as the technology in the iPhone improved, it became easier to both have all the apps and the phone features that the iPhone did, while also having music. In an age where you could listen to music on your telephone, the iPod was simply no longer relevant. Apple had simply made products that had the same purpose, but more functionality, essentially stamping out their own product. The iPod was quietly taken out back and put down by Apple on May 10th, 2022. While supplies last, one can go into an Apple store and pick up an iPod Touch, but in a very short time, they will sell out and go the way of Alf Pogs and the Virtual Boy. This was ultimately for the best. The iPod had its time in the sun, but there was so much going against it that its fall was not only inevitable, but welcomed. The iPhone outperformed it, and Apple simply followed the money. This was the rise and fall of the iPod.